In a January 2024 survey of 2,000 people in the UK, 15.5% declared that their mental health was the worst it had ever been. According to the charity Mind, 1 in 4 people in the UK will experience a mental health problem of some kind. It could easily be me, or you, or someone in our family. Without a doubt, mental health challenges are a real issue for people in our churches. So how can we be the kind of communities that welcome, support and care for these precious people in their time of need? How can we as leaders and as churches not be overwhelmed by the need? I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director of Roots for Churches, and today I'm talking to Corin Pillings, the Director of Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries in the UK. Sanctuary's mission is to equip the church to support mental health and well-being. And I know the things he has to say will be a real help for you in your ministry. Corin, welcome to the Roots for Churches podcast. It's fantastic to have you with us today.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Melanie.
And today we're going to look at the idea of mental health and supporting mental health well in our churches. It's very topical. You are part of Sanctuary Mental Health Charity. Can you tell us a bit more about how you got into that role?
Yeah, certainly. So, I was really drawn to Sanctuary as a charity. Now, it's a church that was first founded in Canada, and its founding story involves 2 people who were in ministry, 2 ministers of the Church of Canada. And they found themselves sharing a similar dilemma, and that was that they were both people who had identified that they were living with mental health challenges themselves and had gone to their congregations and said, look, I need you to know that this is what I'm dealing with. And they found similarly that the congregation saying, well, we really want to be as supportive as possible, but we've no idea where to start. And so that's now, I think, coming for 13 years ago, that conversation first happened. And that led to them creating what was called the first Sanctuary course. And really the aim of that course was to help people understand mental health from a faith perspective, and also bringing in the stories of people who are Christians around their experience of their mental health, and particularly also thinking of how can we as church get the best information around mental health so that we can be there for one another and we can understand what we need. So, I was really taken with that model when I heard about it. And, they approached me to set up the UK branch of Sanctuary UK, which is what I've been doing for the last 4.5 years. And while the reason why, the topic resonated with me so much, really, there are a couple of things that were driving it. One is that, I'd spent 20 years working on the front line with homeless people. And, often when you're interacting with people who've had experiences of homelessness, you'll find that, mental health challenges for many is very much kind of part of their experience. The thing that I sort of learned in all of that time, within sometimes the complexity of wanting to respond in a way that was, appropriate and helpful. And in all that I'd learned in doing that, there was still something that really excited me about the fact that often people will go through immense difficulty and find incredible ways of developing new approaches to life, finding, just new life in different ways. Sometimes that was to do with something that was obviously a faith journey or their recovery. Other times it was just through kind of that incredible ability that many people have, resilience, I guess, is that combination of factors to overcome immense difficulty. So there was something in that experience that stayed with me. And I think maybe there's another piece to touch on, which is, I think, a really important part of why I'm doing this as part of something that is an offer to our church communities. And that's around the theology of Shalom and the kingdom of God. And I think as I started to read up more on this kind of theology, the idea that, perhaps our Christian legacy was not just about salvation, but it was also about our thriving and our flourishing, and that you start to see in the Old Testament and beyond this deep desire that God has for our flourishing. And yet, of course, that needs to be balanced with the fact that many of us are in difficulty on a daily basis. Many of us probably don't quite reach that point of flourishing. It might be a time of, a brief period of our lives or a season. And so the reality is that, there are challenges and struggles. And we believe that the God who saved us is the God that's with us. So in all of that mystery, I felt really drawn to this work and really wanting to equip the church and those beyond it, really, with ways to engage in this and what it means to be human what it means to, understand our well-being. And of course, within that, and understand.
Wow, there's a lot in that. I'm glad you're called to this. I often feel like God just brings the right people to these ministries. It's beautiful. Can we come back to this idea of shalom? So shalom being the Hebrew word for peace, and it doesn't just mean sort of the lack of fighting, but it means sort of well-being, healthy connection, prosperity. It's a life in all its fullness, isn't it? I wish you shalom is a huge blessing.
Absolutely. And, I think there are two elements to it, I think, in terms of how we understand it, because it's very easy to think, well, that's a nice idea. That's a nice inspiration. It's kind of a nice thing to have on a greeting card as a piece of theology. But the reality, I think, of shalom is kind of, it's recognizing that all of the goodness, all of the flourishing that is part of our life experience, that God is the author of that. So for me, in recognizing that, there's a deep humility, which I think is a really important part of what it means to be human, particularly when you're talking about these complex issues. And I think the other part of it, the other part of shalom, is that that's something that we are invited to participate in. And, this vision of well-being, it's very, very different. The one that might be sold to us, I think, that's sort of packaged. And I think that the main thing I think that's different about this is it's something that is communal and participatory, and it's not as individualistic, I think, as perhaps the more kind of commercial one that we can be sold. And that's not to kind of be down on some of those good things that can happen from us paying attention to our individual well-being. It's very, very important we do that. But it's also saying, hang on, this is bigger than us as an individual. There are ways in which we can build shalom, build our flourishing, build our well-being that can really impact others positively too. In the gifts that we receive, we can offer to others. And I think that's one of the other essences of shalom. We participate in it.
Yeah, I like that, because I think the well-being, as you were using the word, I was like, I can picture the colours that go with well-being marketing. They're pastels, they have cups of tea with them, they have, a pile of nice books and a comfy sofa. It's very self-oriented for good reason. But what you're saying about shalom is that it's relational, it's part of community. It's not that there's not an individual in that, it's not that the individual's needs are neglected, but that relational wholeness is often relational unwholeness and brokenness is what causes an awful lot of stress and mental illness, and healthy attachment and healthy relationships often does lead to that flourishing. And so that idea of shalom being about relational connection, and the church surely has a role in that. The church should be modeling healthy relationships and should be a place where people who are new or are vulnerable can find a safe place to land and to build some of those relationships. And often it's not, but as the church, we could get better at that, at being that place for healthy relationships.
Well, for sure. And I think some of that also is about an understanding of shalom, about being about, our relationship with God, even in difficulty. And that, in a way, the best kind of marker of shalom is around that idea that, we are connected to God, whatever we're going through, and that actually, our flourishing may not be dependent on our physical. And, within the way that we look at the Bible, it's actually around our status before God. And I think just to dig into that a little bit more closely, I don't want to, in a way, kind of infer that that's always about us. Because, of course, if we're going through a really challenging period within our mental health, then our agency is very limited and can be. And so it's really important just to see that we are, in a way, God holds us within that space, as much as we, of course, do have agency and can make choices. And it's very important to use those things. Some of that is about being held up by others in a way that could be useful too. It's also to recognize that, God is holding us, and there's that affirmation of that, I think, that's really important as well in context of this.
Yeah, and I think our culture has this idea that flourishing or health happens when everything's perfect. When our health is perfect, when our relationships are harmonious, when we have enough money, when we have a good job, when we have the things on our personal to-do list ticked off, then I will be happy, and then I will feel well in myself. And I think we're talking about a different version of well-being, which is not about our externals, and there can be conflict around us and we are still held. There can be lack of health around us and we're still held and we're still in relationship and we're not alone. That feels quite countercultural to what's out there and what we're being told.
I think it's deeply countercultural. And I had a really interesting conversation, some training I delivered a little while ago. So in our training, we offer a model that we call the mental health continuum. And it's been developed by Dr. Corin Pillings, who's a sociologist and psychologist. And what he was interested in looking at was sort of how do people live well fundamentally? And is there a difference between the life experiences of people who have diagnosed mental health problems and those that don't? And what was really interesting was that he discovered that having a diagnosis was not a barrier to people experiencing this flourishing. Now, the caveat, of course, is that you may be more finely balanced. There may be particular things that are really needed that are fundamental that you have less flexibility over. If those things aren't in place, it's going to be harder for you to flourish. But that finding was very important. And the example I want to give is just a story. I was talking about this and saying, look, principle of this is basically saying that we will all go through periods of challenge. And we talk about this idea of languishing, flourishing. And, for many of us, a good day will be something in between. It doesn't feel too dramatic, or it doesn't feel like we're on a mountaintop. But that is all of our life experience. And some people will struggle perhaps more with languishing. But the reality is that it will shift, and it will shift depending on the access that we have to resources that help, relationships that help, the state that we're in spiritually, all of these things, as well as some really fundamental things, as anyone who is in a low income community will tell you. If your housing's not right, if your diet's not right, or again, if you're not in safe relationships, for example, again, not that that's exclusively people who may find themselves in a low income setting, but those can be part and parcel. It's really hard to thrive. You can't build your well-being. But coming back to the story, somebody in the group said, listen, I don't want to kind of rain on your parade, but I'm the social worker, and all the people I've met who I work with who are, have a diagnosed mental health issue would say that I'm just not sure I could see that they flourish. And someone else on the other side of the room really bailed me out here, because he said, I really want to speak into this. And he said, the reason why they want to, he said, because I have a bipolar diagnosis that's really disabling at times. And he said, but actually it's my experience that I flourish. And he said, the reason I flourish is because I get to use my gifts in my setting, in my community, and that is helping others. And the thing, as well as that being a wonderful save for me in a very complex situation, the broader learning I've drawn out from that is just how important, tapping into purpose and meaning is for all of us, and how that can really be the thing that helps us flourish. If we have an outlet for that, then some of these other things that, are deeply difficult to live with can suddenly be held in a way that's much more gentle. And I really appreciated his insight, because it sort of allowed us to make that connection of recognizing, if you know the stuff that really floats your boat, even you might want to use the language of vocation if you're being brand. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but certainly that sense of tapping into the things that give you meaning and purpose can be so important, such a cornerstone to this issue of flourishing, and, maybe the place you find Shalom.
So good. So this is part of why the church really, really has to address these big issues of why is there suffering in the world? Or, what is my calling and purpose? Because although they can seem like big, out there, metaphysical, theological concepts, when the rubber hits the road in our lives, knowing my identity, my purpose, that God is with me in suffering, that suffering's not happening just because I'm a bad person and God's cross with me. All of that theology actually matters, because it allows me to access shalom or resilience. It's the story we tell ourselves that keeps us stuck in our languishing, as you say, or allows us to find a way to flourish. And so, again, it can feel like in our culture, mental health has become a medical thing. This is something that you go to your GP for, you get some pills, you'll feel better, bye, or this is something that the church has no right to talk about because it's health, and health is not the church does spiritual. I don't think that's true, but it can feel very confusing as to where do the boundaries lie? When is this a medical thing? When is this a spiritual thing? When is this an emotional, relational thing? The church has touch points into all of that. Can you speak to that confusion? Because I think as churches, we want to get involved, but we don't want to overstep and we don't want to do harm. But I think we end up being too cautious, perhaps.
It's a brilliant question. And I think in a way, it highlights the fact that we're playing catch up on this conversation. And the way that I sometimes frame it is that, it feels like the conversations have been happening for a very long time outside of the church, again, within perhaps a more medicalized model. And I guess as Sanctuary, what we're trying to do is bring that conversation to the heart of the church, really by saying that, our mental health is the whole of our life experience. Now, there are times when we will need help with that, all of us in different ways. Some of that might mean a medical intervention. And so a depth of understanding around that can only be useful. But actually, I think just to reduce it down to something that is about the medical concern is kind of, in a way, it's ignoring the fact that, our flourishing is down to multiple factors. And, there will be people who might be living with a diagnosis that could be a severe mental illness, for example. And, to suggest that perhaps the only thing that can help somebody in that situation is medicine, I think is problematic because, time and time again, research proves people's relationship in their community, the health of their spiritual life, as well as those other fundamental things in terms of kind of diet, housing, are really, really important parts of this. So there's something about the fact that this needs to speak to all of us. And I think also theologically, there's something about the importance of being communities where the experiences and the valid voices of people who in other settings may be naturally more marginalized need to inform who we are as the church together. And I'm not saying that's straightforward. There are some of us that just will need a bit more support and help proactively, and that can bring challenge with it. But, if we start to divide out those individuals, then it becomes problematic because you're kind of talking about, well, who's in and who's out. And that's, again, I don't want to be minimizing of those who maybe have had experiences of maybe offering support and help, and it's been quite challenging to them. But also, equally, I don't want to minimize the experiences of people who have often had very complex mental health challenges and have had very negative experiences within our faith groups and within our churches. And so there's something of that shift that needs to happen for all of us. So it's about that recognition of it's important we normalize this conversation. It's increasingly coming up in our communities. There are certainly strands of mental health diagnoses that are growing within our communities. But also, I think our calling as church is to model something that's richer, that's greater, that's more participatory. And so there's something about that I think we want to offer to people, whilst recognizing, of course, this has to come with some cautions and it has to come with learning. It doesn't always happen naturally. And sometimes we need to commit to really understand. But a lot of that understanding, I think, is understanding one another rather than becoming experts in mental health, to quote unquote. It's about who we are as a community. And I think our commitment to saying we want to be the community that will have these conversations, that doesn't mean that we're the community that will be able to fix every problem, nor should we. But we want to be the kind of place where this is a normal conversation to have. And it's a way that we can use our language and our beliefs to explore this in a way that's really helpful. And maybe if there are things that within our beliefs aren't that helpful, we can find a way to challenge those things and offer something that's maybe more helpful and more grounded in something that's the richness of the gospel.
It's good. So the church having this role of being a place where people can know others and be known authentically. And I think there's a challenge to us to think about how we do church in that. So if our churches are a place where we all shuffle in and sit in pews and look at the back of somebody's head while somebody on a stage says some things to us or in a pulpit, are we known and do we know people and can we support them? The person next to you might be feeling suicidal. They might have had the best day of their life. And would you know? And would you get that kind of conversation over coffee at the end? I don't know. Whereas if we can create ways to really know each other, whether it's interaction in our services, sharing opportunities to chat about meaningful topics, whether that's in small groups or just even happening in the course of our services, whether it's the sort of topics that we preach about, unpacking with vulnerability or authenticity, like here's some of the real challenges we face and acknowledging that, I think that goes away towards sort of opening up these conversations. But I think I really do think sometimes as churches we need to sort of scratch our heads and go, is the structures that we've got really working to support and build community? Because I'm not sure they do.
It's a really good question. And I think, as churches, we're under so many challenges at the moment. It's a brave question to ask, I think. And in a way, I want to start at one end of it, of kind of almost having some empathy for the person who's just kind of, all I can do is turn up. And thinking, well, how do we start to involve that person in a way, particularly if that individual is someone who secretly might be harboring some real concerns around their mental health, that they're, one of the reasons why they're even coming to church is the fact that they are in difficulty. And I think, we need to take for granted that a number of people in our congregations, whether it's spoken or not, will be experiencing that, and I think that because of that, it's really important that if the only interaction that person has with our church is in a service, that we are naming these things, and we are also naming how we can offer support, actively, because that person may never find themselves a small group. It's almost like the driver is, I've come because I need something. And I don't, this isn't everyone's experience, but there might be someone who said, I'm in despair. So how am I finding hope in this? And I think that the more that we can speak into this and talk about these issues in a way that is grounded and real, and I think, gets that balance, I think that we touched on earlier around something of the hope of the gospel and the transformation and the vision of shalom and well-being and flourishing with the reality of the toughness and difficulty of life. And that so many of us have these experiences, sometimes for a very long period, sometimes throughout our lives, where we feel bereft, we're experiencing the impact of trauma and difficulty, and almost the acknowledgement of that and the balance of these things. And it's sort of, I just love that verse. I think it's in Psalm 88, the phrase, darkness is my only friend. Like the reality of that scripture for me is such a comfort, because I have experienced that. So I want other people to know that too, that there's that sense in which, the God that we are, wanting to follow and the God that we're wanting to share with others, it's not the one who is asking you to, just maintain a frame of positivity at your expense. That God is grounded in the darkest of your emotions, as you might experience them, and the difficulty of your day to day, and perhaps sometimes overwhelming sense of dread and responsibility. So if we can be churches that somehow give room to those emotions and also actively offer the support into that space, I think we can be doing a great work for people, as well as, I think, looking at what we've been touching on here is, what are the ways that we can build vulnerable community together in a way that feels safe enough so that those things can grow at the rate that they need to, the relationships can grow, and we can be that support to one another and find God in our midst.
Yeah. Gosh, who'd want to be a church leader? This is hard work, eh?
It really is. It really is. Yeah.
Oh, but it's so worthwhile and it's so good. And we have the Holy Spirit to guide us and nudge us in the right directions. And I think just opening up this conversation as we are, it is that I loved what you wrote in the article you wrote in the Roots and Worship Together. You talked about one of the church's role is to worship in all the colours of emotion. And as you picked out that bit from, the Psalm, David often laments that some streams of Christianity can have this kind of idea of almost toxic positivity. It can, God save me and everything's good and I'm just going to keep praising. But I think there can be other streams of Christianity that are more serious and solemn, and don't get too excited about that stuff, stiff upper lip and all of that. Your stream of church may have an impact on what emotions are normalized or talked about or are happening regularly. How can we, in our worship or in our services, actually make space for all of this emotion? I think it's slightly easier in a talk, maybe, to tell some stories, but how does the worship as a whole do that?
Well, yeah, it's a brilliant question. And I think you're right to, that sort of emotional timbre is set for us often. I think there's something about recognizing that whatever you're experiencing, that will, become, the primary model of the way that you experience God within that setting. And I think the two things I'll offer, one is, when you know yourself and you're in a space where you feel like you can't actually allow these emotions to be there, then two things can happen. I think one is that I'd want to say, give yourself permission to feel those things, because I think if you're not, then the phrase spiritual bypassing comes into its own here. This idea in which you're trying to feel or believe something that actually your emotions are kind of overriding. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Psalms are so good that you referred to, because they can help us to connect with those, give us always permission to feel those things, just as an example of it. But I also think that, we need to look at our traditions and look at kind of what are the ways in which we can, offer the range of emotions within them and recognize that that's part of being human. And project that Sanctuary was involved in that offered something here was a collaboration we did with a worship collective called Porter's Gate that I'd really recommend people check out. Any of the Porter's Gate music I think is fantastic, because their vision is to try and bring topics that are often seen as outside of our normal conversation and content around worship and bring in those real parts of our life experience. And so we produced Sanctuary songs with the Porter's Gate. And the idea of that was, to offer something that mirrored more of the experiences that people had been through who have been living with mental health challenges. And the thing is, what I found when I listened to that album is that rather than that feeling, like something that was heavy or maudlin, the real authenticity was around it. And I think that was because of the fact that they drew from the stories of people who were contributing to our Resource the Sanctuary course. So they really watched and listened to those films that make up that course. And from that, they then started to reflect on what could be really helpful for that person. What might be the thing that would really draw them to a place of honest worship. Where might that be? So yeah, that's on all the streaming services, Sanctuary Songs by Porter's Gate. So again, that's just a symbol of something. And I'm not saying that we're the only people that have done this, but for me, it was a gift because it was really honoring that desire to say, let's broaden out this so that we can feel safe and that our worship experiences are, can be authentic to who we are, yet also honest to God.
Because I think as a worship leader, it can be down to how comfortable you are experiencing those emotions, how much you can allow other people to experience them through sung worship or through any other sort of liturgy or prayers that you're leading. Your own ability to sort of sit with a feeling or sit with a thought with God permissions other people into it. And so there is stuff about going deeper with God and owning our own emotions as worship leaders. I think the temptation can be to let's just focus on the goodness of God. Let's just focus on Jesus triumphing over sin, Jesus on the cross, and that it's all, I feel bad, but God, and I'm going to keep looking up. And that's not necessarily wrong, but sometimes we can rush the acknowledging of where we're at, acknowledging of the suffering, acknowledging of the difficulty, even acknowledging our sin can get rushed in the quick, let's put the focus on the positive. God's good all the time, and he's worthy of praise, and he is. But somehow there's something about worship that is that journey that takes people, and we don't want to be fixing people. We want the kindness and goodness of God to draw them. So I do think there's a real dance in that worship leading of invitation and an encounter, rather than sort of shoehorning down people's throats of sing this and you'll feel better.
Oh, for sure. And I think, a lot of it is within the permission that you give people to take part or not. And, recognizing that for some of us, if we're feeling low, the best possible thing is to be swept up in that wonderful lift of we're here, our voices are together, here we are worshiping God. And for others of us, that might be the worst possible thing that we would experience. Yeah. So I think, again, partly it's also suspending our judgment. And if we can, again, recognize that people are going to need to have different experiences of this. And maybe some of it needs to physical space. It's kind of saying, there may be some of us here who need quiet right now. There's capacity for that. Again, not every building allows that. I recognize it, and it's just offering a thought around that. But I really love what you said, because I think for me, what really landed is that sense in which, oh my word, all those worship leaders kind of almost feeling the pressure to always bring the party.
Yeah.
That's real, I'm sure.
People need to feel uplifted because they come to church. And
Yeah.
And we do feel that, but it's we're ushering in the presence of God, and maybe God wants to do something really gentle and comforting rather than triumphant. So yeah, it is that challenge with worship of, some worship songs are very reflective and it allows us to focus on ourselves. And I've heard people say, well, that's not really worship. Worship is where you're focusing on God and you get your eyes off yourself. But I think that it's relational, isn't it? If you're totally in denial of what's going on with you, you're not fully present. But equally, I think sometimes God does want to shift our attention and draw our attention to, other things that help us shift our mood and shift our emotion and shift our faith to a different place. So yeah, it's definitely not one size fits all with all of this. But it's permissioning, I think, to, as you say, worship in that full colour range, acknowledging, maybe bringing testimonies, hearing the voices of those who are struggling and suffering, that maybe not all the testimonies from the front of church are, and that's all better now. It's all fixed now, praise the Lord. That some are in progress and I'm still trusting. Some are that I'm suffering and this is hard, hold me in your prayers. Like that full spectrum of answered prayer and not answered prayer, I think is quite healthy for us as a church to realise.
Very much. And I think our role also of, ensuring that we are not trying to resolve it in a good way when people share those things, but actually just affirm we believe that God is with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the theology of suffering, because I think that's really key to this. Yeah. Which I'll just let you take that where you want to go. What do you think the church needs to hear about that theology?
I think, one of the things that's really hard for us as humans is just kind of come to terms with the reality of it, I think. And I speak with you personally, there have been times when I've been, experiencing really difficult emotions that I just long to shift, and yet it is part of being human, and the kind of the way that sort of Jesus modeled the full range of those emotions and in these different settings is such an encouragement to me, in all of the kind of in the Gospels themselves, the kind of there's such richness of that, I think, if we spend time with it. And so there's something about almost, I think, whether it's not just about what you might call the really dark times, but in the ordinariness and, whether that's the mundanity of parenting under 5, for example, or whether it's, just within those situations where you can't really feel the flourishing very much. There's something around, of course, there is a part of me which is kind of, let's look at that together. It may be that you don't have to suffer it, but also the fact that you are is normal. And let's be saying that rather than somehow suggesting that that's in any way a reflection of your lack of faith, or, that somehow it's your fault, which again, I think it might sound uncontroversial to name that, but I think those thoughts can stick around and they can inform often how we view people who are going through challenges. And it might be just to do with the fact that we feel really challenged by the fact that we'd love for that to be different for them. And actually we feel powerless because we can't make that different for them. And, some of us, we can't make it different for ourselves. So why would we be able to make it different for somebody else? And so I think there's a lot of complexity often around why these thoughts come up, as well as, of course, the more obvious things about the messages that we received, perhaps as we were growing up, be that, just within our parenting, or perhaps, what we understood a Christian to be, a follower of Jesus. So there's something around when those moments arrive of kind of, again, just allowing that to be a normal part of life, but also, I think, at times saying, well, perhaps there are things that we could be looking at doing differently that can really help this stuff. And I think, in that, I think there's a deep invitation of faith that's kind of bringing that before God. Of course, these times of endurance are really important, but also there's a question of, Lord, is there anything more that could change the situation for me? Is there anything more that you have for me? And some of that might be involve others too on that journey, So it's hardly a theodicy, but I'm wanting to normalize a difficult experiences, I think, as well as recognizing that they will take energy, and at times, the right thing to do is absolutely to look at, hang on, what is causing this? And that, I think, I really want to, at this point, I want to be a strong advocate for therapy where it's needed. Now, I know that that's not always possible for everybody. it's sometimes hard to access that. There's a great partnership that we have with the Association of Christian Counselors, and we love the work they do and the fact that they're qualified therapists, advertise that they are people of faith. So again, if that's an important conversation to you, it means that that's in the mix. But what's equally important is that these people are trained professionals, and if you look at the ACC website, you can get access to a therapist. And again, I think, perhaps my generation and below, it feels less of a taboo, perhaps, but that's maybe not for everybody. And so there will be these times when life feels a bit stuck, and getting some help on that and getting room with somebody who's safe to really explore that can be a very, very important transformative thing. And again, I speak personally, having reached a cul-de-sac in my life that needed help, that I've tremendously benefited from, a therapist, very skilled individual, who also had a faith background. That, it may be that someone without faith can be equally helpful to you. But, let's explore these things and allow that to feel like a normal part of how we do life, perhaps when we hit barriers and difficulties or particular seasons that are difficult for us.
I just want to pick up on that idea of a generational difference in how we approach things. I think I've noticed that older people, perhaps my parents' generation or slightly younger than that, would not want to talk about their struggles with anxiety or depression, or would tend to minimize that struggle or see it as very, very private, and would put on a polite or a brave face at church. And also perhaps some of the theology around, wanting to believe God will see them through if they keep praying, or if they keep focused on praising God, or whatever the sort of theology line it is along that. There's sort of a generational pattern of like, this isn't really something we talk about. Compare that to, say, maybe millennials and younger, who mental health is like a word that will probably come out of their mouth 5-10 times a day. My kids are always like, oh, it's my mental health, da da da. And so they talk about their struggles and are really happy to be quite vulnerable, etc. And I think there can be a bit of a culture clash or a generational clash of expectations of like how we see that. Like, what is strength? What is weakness? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? What's professional to share? What's polite to share? What's an overshare? So I guess I'd love you to talk to this, like, how do we as a church set an environment that's going to work across that spectrum of people who don't think you should talk about this and it's really embarrassing, to other people who are like, I'm having a mental health day, I'm off, it's fine. And so for some people, they can look at that and think they just need to get some resilience, they need to knuckle down. This is not a mental health crisis, this is just they're feeling a bit wobbly, they need to push through. But they're probably in reaction to older generations who, their legs come off and they're still soldiering on. So like we're on very ends of the poles here. And I wonder how we create an intergenerational church community that has a healthy sense of mental health, community and support that covers both of those ends of the spectrum.
That's great. I mean, that's a really complex piece right there. I love the question. Maybe we could do a whole one on that. Well, let me have a go. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that spring to mind for me, Melanie, and that's one, I think, firstly, two things to acknowledge. In terms of framing the conversation, I think it's really important to recognize that we are seeing many more symptoms of anxiety, particularly within our children and young people. So I just want to name that's a reality that we're facing. Okay, so it's important that we don't diminish that in answering this question. I think the other thing that, I've learned in this work is a recognition that we all have what you would call a window of tolerance. So that is what you might call a kind of, a container for our emotions where we can function well. And some of us different experiences will mean that window of tolerance means sometimes we have to leave certain situations to help ourselves feel safe. That there are certain things that we need to do in order to kind of almost regain that emotional grounding in our nervous system in order to feel okay. So, that kind of language possibly for my parents' generation would be very unusual. And I think it's becoming less unusual to those who are younger. And I think it's not just because I'm involved in this mental health field. I think that there has been that shift. And what I would say is, there's a danger of just almost the kind of the blanket header of it's my mental health being something that stops the conversation rather than encourages it. And let's get into the detail of that. Can you tell me more of what you're experiencing so I can support you in that, as a parent? Or even in that moment, if you can't say it because you're what we call flooded, okay, we know that you need to take yourself out of these situations to feel okay. And then let's talk about what was going on from there. That's part of our normalization of this conversation, I think. I think it's making sure that we don't just accept the broad brush headlines for dealing with a situation that's deeply personal, that will continue to change and evolve. And also fundamentally, we have agency in, we can take responsibility for. And I think, again, there's a whole piece in adolescence, isn't there, of learning that. That's the job of an adolescent, really, kind of how you, on the one hand, you're being cared for and, by your care, your parent, those around you. And then also how that shifts around peers, and you get your sense of who you are and what's possible, both your strengths and perhaps the things that are more challenging and more vulnerable. So it's, we need to ensure that these guys have got wide containers to be held in, and that we've got room and we're not too reactive to them, I think, so that they can feel safe to explore this. But also, I think some of our job, if we don't understand, is to really understand and listen. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this new resource that Sanctuary have developed, which is a youth series. And, ostensibly, we've created that for those who are leading groups with young people. And we put this resource together with the help and input of 50 young people who said, these are the things that we want to talk about regarding, our mental health and our faith. And so you see and hear the stories of these young people around that. Now, what I wasn't expecting when I started looking at the material and seeing the amazing work that my colleagues have done to put together this very dynamic resource, really engaging resource, was just how much I would learn by listening to their stories. Okay. And I think that for me is that's a universal. It's not just young people. It's about when we get to know that person, the depth of the challenge perhaps that they're facing in some cases, but more as who they are. Then that's a way of really connecting with something, because it takes it away from perhaps what might be our initial value judgments of, wow, you should be doing better at this, I did, to actually learning about that person. I think that's the biggest gift that we can offer, and of giving people the benefit of the doubt. And also, young people particularly recognizing that things are changing and shifting all the time. That's part and parcel. So I'm not sure I've fully answered it, but that's maybe one part of that conversation.
Yeah, well, I think what you're saying is like that there's a gift in listening really well, listening without an immediate agenda or like a plan before they've even finished talking. And that there's something about creating spaces for people to talk about this. So this is where the Sanctuary course, so there's an adult version that can be run and in small groups in your church, but there's also the youth version that can happen in youth groups, or I imagine it'd be quite interesting as an intergenerational exercise to have youth and adults together talking about these things, learning across the generations. That would be fun. But yeah, as you say, like we learn because we see the image of God in other people as well. And it's very easy to judge when you're talking about concepts or ideas, or they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that. But when you hear somebody's story, you think, I don't know how they would have done anything else. And how can I get alongside you? And how can we as a community shift or get better so that this isn't your struggle? So as you say, like as we hear the stories, it changes us and makes us better supporters. So I think that's a fantastic reason for people to get involved and check out the course. Even if they're not going to run the course, they could watch the videos, can't they?
Entirely. And my sense is if you do, you really will learn something. Something will spur. And the same is true of the Sanctuary course itself, which is for the older age group. And I think, often when we think about mental health, that some of us might think, well, it's complex, or, hang on, what about all these different conditions? And the Sanctuary course doesn't ignore that complexity, but it doesn't lead on trying to teach you about those different diagnoses. And the reason why it does that is because actually it's about the individual human experience of each person, the story that is told about that person. So you might look at it and not have any experience of the diagnosis that person's facing, but what you might resonate with is the idea of, I've been through real difficulties that felt unsolvable. Perhaps even something shifted as what you would perceive as an act of God in your life. That's something that you might relate to. Or you might relate to the fact that, hang on, this person seems really normal and yet they're really struggling. And that challenges perhaps for some of us our perception of what mental health might look like. Equally, we might see someone who in other ways would be seen as more marginalized. And within, I think, the Sanctuary course, there are a number of examples of this where there's incredible insight of faith from people who've been through very difficult experiences. The thing that I love is that suddenly there's a platform for that story to be told and for that person to be seen in a way that they've not been able to historically. And I think there's something deeply redemptive in that. I hope there is. I mean, maybe it's not for me to say for that person, but there was for me in my experience when I've heard those stories,
Yeah, and we need to hear from the broad range, not just the presentable people that end up in our pulpits. And one thing I would think as a church leader is there's a little bit of hesitation around talking about mental health a lot in church, because we know there's lots of mental health challenge around us. We know that the NHS is oversubscribed and it's a long waiting list. If I start talking about this in my church, are people going to be blowing up my phone, turning up on my doorstep, going, "Oh, minister, vicar, you just said this on Sunday. That's totally what's going on with me. Can you help?" And that I could get overwhelmed by the need. So can you address that? Like, I don't think most ministers get a lot of training in mental health and support. They may not even get any counselling training. Is this going to open a can of worms that is going to be really difficult?
It's really good to think through what your strategy is. Now, one thing I would say, I think in reality, some of the research that we've seen shows us that often the first time that people will disclose a mental health challenge will be to their minister. So the fact is, this is happening already. Now, if you add that to the kind of almost saying, listen, we're making a commitment to doing this, it's really important to think about two things, I think. One, I would say, is that it's really important to see that if somebody is experiencing a mental health crisis, that is one part of their experience. So either side of that, there may be actions that could have prevented it in some cases, not always. Equally, beyond that, there are steps that will help recovery. Okay. So it's just recognizing that sometimes when people show up in crisis, that is one element of their story and there's something beyond it. So just framing it that way, I think is really key. But also, I think to help respond to those situations, it's both thinking about, the care that might be needed in that moment, but also the respect that you offer to that person. And the respect, I think, is offered in empowering them to make choices about their situation and not taking it on. Now, I know that could be easier said than done. Some of us very naturally do that in life. But I think we need to be able to put that up front and saying, it's really not your job to fix that, but it might be your job to really listen to that person and then think about, okay, what steps do you need to take now? Perhaps there's some provision within church that can assist, but it might be more likely that provision is going to be elsewhere to start with. And then we can be the place and the community that support you in your recovery journey. But if someone is in crisis and they need particular help at that moment, it's really, there's something about recognizing that. And I think I agree, that's where some of the training really come in. But I think, part of destigmatizing this is recognizing that is one moment. Also, reflecting recently, I think another part of stigma, maybe a less conscious version of it, is that hesitancy that we have, that is almost that sense in which, this is going to be bad. Now, I know that many of us in ministry, we're really stretched and have very good reasons to kind of want to protect our time and resources. But that's one of the reasons why, again, I want to really advocate the Sanctuary course, because the whole point of the course is to really take, that responsibility for that mental health conversation and bring it to all of us. So we will then be that congregation that say, this is a normal conversation for us to have, and we know how to support each other well. Because that's a very important part of the course too. So it's not just going to be the minister anymore who is the person who has to triage this and be the only person that provides support. We're more aware of the support that each of us needs.
That's really helpful. So it's an empowering and equipping the whole church to be ministers in this. But Sanctuary also does training. So if you are a minister and thinking, I'm facing a lot of this, they can come and approach Sanctuary and get training or get signposted to ways to help.
Yeah, there are multiple ways in which we've done this. We're actually been training those in ordination particularly. So that for me is great because it feels that we're upstream, which is a great place to be. We'd love to talk to you if this is an area that you're interested in, for sure.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the work you're doing, for the resources you're creating, and for this conversation. I feel enriched and have lots to think about, and hopefully it will change those who've listened, the way that they talk about mental health, or just the willingness to listen better in those conversations, to hear some of the stories. So the website we want to recommend to people, let me get this right, sanctuarymentalhealth.org/UK. Not .uk, /UK. And that's where you can find all of Sanctuary's resources.
It's all there. It's all free. And, I just want to say thank you for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I think you've had some fantastic questions to explore. And I think just maybe to end on, I'm very aware that, a conversation like this for many people can be a very emotive conversation. And, if you are in a position right now where you are feeling overwhelmed by the challenges that you're facing around your mental health, please reach out. Please make sure that you get the support that you need, whether that is through your GP. There are various support lines that you can access. The Samaritans are an incredible group of volunteers who are available at any point. Also, the Calm support line. So post 5 o'clock, if you feel that you're experiencing a mental health crisis, Calm are another support line that are available. But the main thing is, if you're feeling overwhelmed, that, just to encourage you to act and saying that, God is there and with you, and these supports are available too. So, I know I don't want to make too big a deal of it, because I know it's not everyone's experience, but also I think there will be people listening who may be going through difficulty and until this point, they've not taken steps around it. And maybe it's time to.
Thank you. Such wise words, Corin. Do really appreciate you. And we will put links to all of these things in the show notes so you can click through and follow them that way. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I want to encourage you to check out Corin's fantastic article in Roots Worship Together magazine, issue 137, and visit the Sanctuary website, where you can get in touch with Corin and his team and see all the resources that we talked about. Roots produce a huge spread of resources that can help you lead a great church. We offer Bible notes to help with sermon preparation, sermon starters, dramas, creative and interactive ideas for services, song and hymn suggestions, small group Bible studies, youth sessions, articles on leadership and theology. Our Thrive resource helps families grow in their faith throughout the week. We offer activity sheets, content for your toddler groups, seasonal outreach ideas, prayers, intercessions. Do you know what? It's a lot. And it's all for a great value annual subscription that will save you and your church loads of time and money. So come and check out our latest resources, flip through the archive, take out a free trial at rootsforchurches.com. If you're already a subscriber, please spread the word. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Together, we can grow.